Chinese government is responding to COVID-related riots and protests by easing some lockdown restrictions in 8 mainland cities and Hong Kong. However, President Xi Jinping is keeping his zero COVID policy in place. That means millions of Chinese citizens are still confined to their homes. Coronavirus infections took a dramatic jump this fall, and now they average just over 29,000 cases per day. What might the lockdowns and ongoing disruptions in China mean for the global supply chain, especially for a world economy dependent on Chinese products? Well, here to share his insights is the senior advisor to the Atlantic Council, Harlan Ullman. Mr. Ullman is author of the book, The Fifth Horseman and the New Mad: How Massive Attacks and Disruption Became the Looming Existential Danger to a Divided Nation and the World at Large. Harlan, Xi Jinping has a real mess on his hands, a declining economy, COVID cases on the rise, and now these protests and riots. So how do you expect this may affect the global supply chain?
Badly. And in fact, it's worse than that. The Chinese will get through these riots. The riots are fairly commonplace. They're just not well reported. But what is interesting, and as I point out in my book, Massive Attacks of Disruption, not only has COVID disrupted China, but it's disrupted supply chains. Look what happened to the stock exchange, dropping 500 points on the Dow. And so these disruptions are really something that we have to deal with in ways that we hadn't thought about, but they're certainly extremely important.
And there are many of them. I know the COVID virus, of course, was the great disruptor for the world economy. But how about beyond China? The war in Ukraine is still disrupting the oil and gas supply chain.
Absolutely.
And what do you expect might happen there?
But also food supplies. Look at wheat that's coming out of Odessa, which is occasionally stopped by the Russians. And so what you have to understand is that in a world that is much more advanced technologically, it's also far more vulnerable to disruptions. I mean, how could you deal with life without your cell phone or your computer or without water? And similarly, because the world is so interdependent, for better or for worse, these disruptions have huge impacts, not only economically, but politically and socially. And that's why I argue these are the looming threats about which we are totally, or I should say, largely unprepared in terms of organization or intellectual strategies to deal with them. And it's something I point out in my book. Here's how we fix these problems, along with other problems that are confronting us, including the most disruptive of all of these, failed and failing government, irrespective of whether Republicans or Democrats are in charge here.
Well, I want to get to that in a moment, but climate change, or at least the response to it in places like Europe, are causing food supply chain issues, as you mentioned. But how likely is it that those shortages may subside?
Well, actually, the irony here is that there are the means to produce food. For example, the Netherlands is one of the greatest producers of food because of vertical farming. And so we have the technology. The question is whether or not we can apply the technology quickly enough to be able to produce enough food. That is complicated by huge water shortages. Probably the scarcest material on earth is water. Look at the United States. The Colorado River is now a creek, and California is going to be having to ration water.
What does the future hold? What's the danger that's looming over the world in the United States? I know the recent election showed that we're still a divided country. So how likely are we to see riots here?
Well, I'm not sure we're going to see riots. The problem is that the Constitution is being threatened by our political system right now because of these huge divisions. The good news about the election was that a number of extremists were not voted into office. The bad news is that extremism, whether the far left or the far right, still exists, and that's what we have to deal with. And I think the only way we can deal with it is through the president. We only have one president at a time. I've argued that President Biden needs to bring the leadership of Congress together at Camp David or some other venue to agree on 3 or 4 or 5 different items, which we can then pass into law that'll put the country on the right direction. But as long as both parties view the other party as evil and are prepared to use virtually any means to defeat that party, this country is on a very, very bad trajectory. And it's far more dangerous in my mind than any dangers that are posed by Russia, China, Iran, or North Korea. The problems are here, and Americans have to realize, well, we have international issues that we cannot ignore, and they're very important. We've got to get things right in America, and we're not doing a very good job.
Okay, briefly then, in addition to what you just mentioned, what else should we do? How should we
Well,
respond?
I've got a list of things that need to be done in terms of how we reorganize government, how we prepared for the next COVID or pandemic, how we have better strategies for national security, national defense, and how we modernize both the executive and legislative branches that are still organized almost as they were under George Washington. People can read those recommendations. Many of them are really, I think, quite important, such as a national infrastructure bank to improve infrastructure, and indeed the need for a chief operating officer to make government work. And finally, and this will make you smile, one of the things to fix Congress: before any member of Congress votes on a bill, he or she has got to swear or affirm that they have read and understand it.
Well, I understand that's going to happen in the House. They're going to read the whole thing. Okay, the book is The Fifth Horseman and the New Mad: How Massive Attacks and Disruption Became the Looming Existential Danger to a Divided Nation and the World at Large. Harlan Ullman, thank you for sharing your thoughts.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.